Thank you all so much for joining us for our 2019 Doughnuts with Delegates discussion on local housing policy. My name is Ellie Gilmore. I'm the community organizer for Worcester Common Ground. We are really excited to have you all in a room together. We know that Worcester is in this really wonderful but also pivotal point in the development of our city, where there are so many exciting things happening and so many new people who are coming in, and it's hard to keep up with all of that. But it also is important to take a step back for a second and think about, as people who are interested in housing, as stakeholders in the housing discussion, are we meeting the need for what people are asking for? And so we wanted to gather everyone together today to kind of take down affordable housing to the studs. It is a complex topic. There is no other way to describe it. We acknowledge that. And so we want to spend a little time working with everyone to get on the same page so that we can start talking about some potential policy solutions. I'm going to hand it over to Yvette, and she is going to talk about housing. So affordable housing 101.
Everyone should have a choice of housing. And what we started to do was to just break down owner-occupied versus rental, and how much money are people spending on their housing in Worcester. Our owner-occupied right now, if we look at total amounts of households, 29,825. They're already cost burdened at 31%. Renter-occupied, 40,967. Are rent burdened at 50%. So Worcester right now is at 13.4% with affordable housing, and that's great, and we're grateful. But the 10% threshold that's always talked about is
a minimum.
It's minimum. Thank you. And I think we have to think about how we're going to raise that percentage. And I'm not saying that it needs to just be the CDCs. I think we need to talk about the city as a whole. How are we going to be able to increase that type of housing so that all of these folks are able to live here? We have some thoughts on how we can move forward with that.
I wanted to take a moment just to think about why Worcester is experiencing some degree of an affordability challenge. We also recognize that affordability challenges are not the same across the board. So Worcester is not in the same dire situation that Boston is, and that's great. We don't want to be where Boston is at with their housing crisis. So we should be able to grow and develop equitably without running into some of these major rent hikes. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about housing from an economic perspective. Housing really is about markets. They behave they can be very volatile. There are a lot of components that go into a housing market. It's a little bit different for rentals versus home ownership. When we develop housing, particularly from the rental perspective, we're looking at low-income markets and high-income housing markets. So a low-income housing market is Piedmont, for example, the neighborhood that we're sitting in right now. It tends to be a combination of subsidized rental units as well as naturally occurring, so that's just because the property values here are lower, the overall income distribution is lower, and so the rents typically reflect that, as well as the quality. So when you have less money, you have fewer choices to spend on your housing, and so you may not get to live in the nicest apartment unit in Worcester, just as a function of your income. High-income housing markets, very similar, almost entirely higher income residential choices. Those are the areas where we start to see some challenges with the rental market. So when you build a lot of high-income housing in one place, then those rents tend to go up and up and up, and then when you have low income here and high income here, they're basically going like this. It functions very much like the income distribution we have in this country. There's no middle. We have this missing middle some degree of concentrated wealth. Often when we talk about affordable housing and developing, sometimes the focus is very much on what we're doing in the low-income neighborhoods, and that's great because as someone who represents the CDC, that is all that we do. You know, we represent the low-income neighborhoods, we represent the housing needs, the open space needs, but there are other housing markets that exist outside of what we do that impact our residents. And we need to start thinking about shifting the focus on how do we make the higher income markets more affordable. So how do we diversify those housing markets to make sure that people from Piedmont can afford to live in the west side or downtown or wherever. And we're starting to do that, right? So there are two really fantastic projects that are happening downtown right now that are both going to be mixed income. One of those buildings is the Central Building. It's going to be 55 units, and I think like 31 of those units are going to be available below 80%. There are dedicated units at 30%, 50%, and 60% AMI. That's huge. That's a huge win for us as a city to have a developer who wants to build a mixed income project that is affordable to people at 30% in a downtown area. Similar is the courthouse project. I think that's like 117 units. And I don't quite know how many affordable, but it's something like 48.
Well, and those are reaching the 80 to 120% AMI.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, those are more towards, like you said, the 80 to 120 workforce housing.
So, you know, we're starting to see slowly that these types of projects are possible and are happening in these higher income areas, but we need more. We need to figure out how to incentivize more development like that across Worcester in a way that's not pulling teeth, that's not too much of a drain on everyone's budget. As I understand, there's never enough money to do what we want to do. So we need to have a combination of subsidized only, mixed income, market rate, and ideally want that all to exist in the same neighborhood. Whether it's, you know, a single family residential district or something like a bustling, dense downtown. We just want to have diversity in our housing all across Worcester. It's how you bring the markets to an equilibrium. Zoning is the backbone of our built environment. So where types of buildings exist, where different uses exist, is a function of zoning. Most zoning codes in most municipalities, from teeny tiny towns, like where I grew up in central Pennsylvania, or to huge cities like New York, right? They are governed by zoning. And so we see some of the consequences of how zoning policies from the mid-1900s still have impacts now. Some of them are good and some of them are not. And when it comes to housing, one of the things that we can do to start building in these affordability mechanisms at little to no cost. That's the other great thing about zoning reform. It essentially doesn't cost anything. You know, it's not putting money into one thing, you're taking out of another. It's policy change. And so there are a number of potential zoning reforms that other cities have adopted. We're looking at it from a perspective of what have other cities done well and how can Worcester implement that. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. In fact, we probably shouldn't. We can look at best practices and successful case studies and say, you know what, that would be really good for Worcester. So the first one is form-based code. So I don't want to get too deep into this, but there are two main different types of zoning. One is a use-based code. That's what Worcester has now. The one that a lot of cities are starting to propose is a form-based code. And form-based code really thinks more about how do buildings, how do they relate to one another? How do we have more complementary uses? How, instead of thinking about, oh, you need a minimum 15-foot setback, That's important, but it really thinks about the aesthetic components of the built environment. That's just as important as what's happening inside the building. If you would like to do some more research, Hartford recently went through a whole zoning reform where they adopted a form-based code that actually is being recognized nationally as a very progressive, very successful form-based zoning code. The second thing is mandatory inclusionary zoning. So inclusionary zoning is something that a lot of cities are starting to adopt now. It essentially is when there is a new residential development, particularly rental, that developer is required by law to include some percentage of their overall rental units to be affordable at a certain rate. When I say mandatory, because there is also optional inclusionary zoning, where instead of a developer putting in affordable units, they pay what are called in lieu fees, and that money goes to support affordable housing elsewhere. That has its benefits. The problem is that it also gives developers an opportunity to essentially buy themselves out of the responsibility to put affordable housing in. They say, well, I don't want to build affordable housing, and so I'm just going to give you money to put the affordable housing elsewhere. It's important to, I don't know if anyone looked through the document that I sent around last Friday. I know that it was very dense, so I don't expect everyone to have read it cover to cover, but I like that document because it goes through some of the economics of inclusionary zoning. It's challenging. Financing all residential projects is tricky. It's a very delicate balance, and a developer can't reasonably make a mixed income project sustainable if they don't have the right financing, if they don't have the right ratio of subsidized units to market rate units. And so, what we don't want to do is have developers making projects that aren't going to last. That's not good for us either. And so, as we start thinking about inclusionary zoning, building in a formula that is flexible. So often public policy is not designed to be flexible, but it matters in this situation where we create a formula that allows projects to be sustainable but affordable. And that's something when we really get into the weeds of a policy discussion, to start thinking about what does that look like, how is it going to work here, who's involved. And I just wanted to then mention two other potential zoning reforms. One is modifying lot sizes. So in our zoning code now, there are a lot of minimum lot size requirements. And the larger the lot, the more expensive that land is. And so we wind up in situations where projects are cost prohibitive because of their size. It's also why the same thing is true with density requirements. So when you can't build above a certain number of stories, we're eliminating the possibility of people being able to develop denser housing, which is cheaper because the square footage is smaller. And so we're kind of already restricting these opportunities for development where we don't necessarily have to. Parking is a major cost. Surface lots particularly take up so much square footage. I mapped out the other week how much square footage surface parking lots take up in Worcester, and it's insane. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but even just looking at a map, it's all over. Part of it is because we are a fairly car-dependent city, and so eliminating parking minimums gives developers a chance to be more dense without spending that money on parking. So when we say, oh, your development has to have 1 space per unit or 1.5 spaces per unit, then we're also requiring them to put money into creating parking. And building parking is expensive. Maintaining parking is expensive. The caveat with eliminating parking minimums is, as I mentioned, we're a fairly car-dependent city, and absent changes to our public transportation, it's going to be a little, we don't want to restrict people's access to their services. So we would like there to be less parking, We would like people to not drive cars as much, but we also can't guarantee that we're gonna have a bus system that will support a lack of parking. So it's just something to keep in mind. It's another trade-off. So I want to open up the floor to people for questions, discussions among each other. What is feasible in Worcester? What position are we in?
One other thing that I would say in terms of zoning is changing the minimum lot size, because a significant portion of Worcester's housing was built at a time when the minimum lot size was 3,000 square feet. And so when those buildings have to come down because they've undergone years of neglect, it's a problem to get them rebuilt, and in some cases you can't. And along with that, I guess in terms of the minimum lot size, also a change that would allow more readily the building of two-family homes.
We changed that about a year ago, for the existing lots. If there's a property that's pre-existing, that had fire in it and knocked the house down or whatever, if it was 4,000, if I remember right, you could build on a 4,000 square foot lot now.
Okay.
So it used to be 5,000, and hopefully that would spark some use in some of the urban areas.
Might be worthy of, I assume the planning department can make this available. How many vacant lots are there that are in that zone? Right? Some of the councilors could get that report for us. I can't imagine it'd be that hard to assemble. I assume it's all digital now, so they can say how many current vacant lots and what are their, how many are in 3 to 4, how many 4 to 5, how many are whatever. So that would actually give you a sense if it's actually where you could do a bunch of.
Yeah, actually, I just put it in order for Tuesday, which I know you've had. I put it before. I'm repeating it again. How many vacant lots, city-owned vacant lots we have in D4?
When you look at average lot sizes for different areas of the country, like the Northwest, Southwest, whatever, New England has by far the smallest amount of area and the largest lot sizes. So simple supply and demand, like your slide just said. If we increase our supply, that'll kind of decrease demand, which is going to level off prices, keeping housing affordable for everybody. Like most areas will be able to support more dense housing, but it really comes down to zoning regulation and a little bit of public opinion too.
We've had to go to the planning board to get a variance on the parking requirements. And I think if you look at the requirement of 2 spaces a unit, it's excessive in certain areas. Our average is about 1.3 cars per tenant. So, just the empirical data seems something that the city should review in their planning process and say that there isn't the need, isn't borne out for 2 places on certain types of housing development.
A housing trust fund is essentially a conduit for funds that produce housing. They often exist at a state level, but increasingly we're seeing them at municipal levels as well. There are 109 municipalities across the Commonwealth that have implemented affordable housing trust funds. When we talk about affordable housing development, it's more than just the physical structure. There are so many components that go into the development of housing, not just affordable housing, but all housing. And what an affordable housing trust fund provides is technical support, which I know the city already does. They provide support for projects, like consultation and site plan review. But the affordable housing trust fund is really more of like a dedicated group of people. It's a board of trustees. They're appointed by the city manager. They function almost identically to existing boards or commissions, and they are the keepers of the money. So the funds for a housing trust fund can come from a variety of different places. Often it's existing public revenue that is diverted into the housing trust fund. It also can come in the form of these in lieu fees. If we have developers who are coming in, we want them to build affordable housing. They might not want to build affordable housing. We say, okay, here's the fee that you have to pay, and that money goes into the affordable housing trust fund. And that money is available to anyone who wants to build affordable housing. It's not like it's one funding source for only CDCs or one funding source for only one other type of developer. Because we have a lot of private developers in Worcester who are developing affordable housing, and there needs to be dedicated funding for that. And so this is a way of kind of expanding who can participate in building affordable housing, because we can say, submit an application. We might be able to assist you with your funding. We might be able to provide some type of technical support. The challenge with Worcester is that in terms of local revenue, bless you, it's unclear, what we might be able to divert, right? Because we're not asking to take away so much money from X department or whatever, but having an understanding of what are some of our existing revenues, whether they be parking meter fees or permits and licensing, or waste disposal fees, all these types of smaller revenues that does add up over time. Where is that funding going now, and is there a way to possibly redirect some of that to this housing trust fund? I mean, we're sitting here having a real conversation about housing, but that doesn't mean that everyone out in the city feels the same way. And so it is incumbent upon us to figure out, how do we redefine affordable housing? How do we get the narrative out there that gives people the right information about it, but also destigmatizes it at the same time? We cannot exist in a city where we have people going around thinking that, not being able to afford your housing is somehow a dirty thing. It's a problem. If people can't afford their housing, that's a problem. But that's also, it's a problem that we have the responsibility to address. But I don't want to leave here without coming up with some follow-up. So Doughnuts and Delegates is an annual initiative of the Massachusetts Association for CDCs. That's why we do it. But it only happens once a year. And I don't want us to, be here in 2020 having had no follow-up and no movement, because I don't think that's worth your time, and I also think that it's not fair to the people of Worcester who are experiencing an affordability problem. That leads us to next steps. So I think if you think about, the communication and collaboration, who are the people who are having these conversations regularly? How do we, I'm going to reframe that. How do we continue to have this conversation in an efficient and effective way?
And as we discussed, we have so many groups,
Yeah.
various groups in Worcester who are so passionate about all these topics, but everyone's coming from a different group, and it just makes it impossible to kind of bring it all together. And we don't have the answer, but we're just sort of saying, how can we strategize around this?
I think something important, to get these points known and things like that, everybody's busy, everybody doesn't have the time to come to a meeting like that, but most of us do have this little computer thing in our pocket that is incredibly powerful. So if you utilize this technology to make communication easier, to get people's voices heard, their thoughts and opinions, and then, conversely as well, to send information back that's steering them in the right way. Like some sort of discussion board, or
Think about it, for renters,
Right.
for homeowners,
Right.
if we had one platform that everyone could gravitate to, it helps with our occupancy rate, it helps getting everybody on the same page.
The last thing, as we wrap up, is resources. No one is absolved of the responsibility to continue to educate themselves about this field, even if you've been doing it forever. There are always new practices that are being researched and implemented, and I think as a city that's on the move and on the rise, we have an obligation to make sure that at each step in that process, we are not sticking with backwards or unsuccessful ways of doing things, and also I think challenging our own thinking. The CDCs currently are part of this workshop series with MHP and CDAC, and those have been really interesting. They cover a variety of topics. One was on fundraising, another was on board governance. The idea is just, getting the CDCs in Worcester specifically to talk to each other.
So MHP is Mass Housing Partnership, and they're one of our funders. We do a lot of permanent loans with them. And CDAC is community, help me out. I forget the acronym. So we work with CDAC for a lot of our pre-development funding, especially as a CDC. And so they've been instrumental in really helping to get folks at the table from Worcester at these workshops.
If you or your colleagues or other people that you have spoken to about housing really want to dive into the meat of this, MHP does a housing institute every year. It's 2 days, and your brain will explode, but in a good way. I think it's sometimes there are components of this discussion that we miss, and so that is also an opportunity. And then the last piece is for people who are looking for ways of learning about these topics that doesn't require going anywhere or spending 2 hours in a meeting. I wanted to suggest a number of online publications, Shelter Force, Next City, Strong Towns, and City Lab, all publish very short but quality, well-researched articles on all urban development topics. And so if you are going out and having conversations with people and they don't want to read a 20-page academic paper, they shouldn't have to. Like, this information should be accessible. And these are publications that I use for my own learning as well. And so I think that's a way to bring people into the conversation. They range from housing to transportation to equity to art and things like that.
We're really grateful. Thank you. We really want to work with the city, and now that we have our new housing director, it's pretty exciting. Good change. Really try and work things out amongst everyone. That if you have interest in walking around the neighborhood, across the street are first-time homeownership properties that we built. Down on Merrick Street, we're building 2 small 950 square foot houses that are really energy efficient that we'll be selling. And there's a host built by Youth Build and a partnership with St. Gomain. So we're very fortunate to have that project underway. And then we have, a host of development that's been done on Piedmont Street. So we're grateful, and we want to keep this neighborhood cranking along and keeping people housed.